As a government, we've been very, very clear that we will stand up for Canadian interests, and we will stand up loudly and clearly for human rights all around the world.
There isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And when I made the videos about Bill C-16, I thought it through, and I thought, there's no damn way I'm following this law. I don't care what happens. And I didn't say that lightly. I thought it through. I thought, okay, well, let's assume the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario would be that a student would report me to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and then they would do an investigation. Then they would find me guilty because the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds 99% of the people brought to it guilty, because that's what totalitarians do. And then I would refuse to pay the fine or cooperate with whatever the re-education they would put me through would be. And then that would move to civil court, and then I would be fined for contempt, and then it would, then the whole legal catastrophe would unfold. And I thought, well, I could either do that, or I could allow the government to regulate my speech. It's like, nope, that's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens, is that individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need? You're looking at 250 million deaths. It's like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. Is you falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be. And that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they're just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had marched through and charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And their commander knew that it was going to be brutal because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. And the commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that. You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps. Because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that. And I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech. It's a mistake. I don't care what compassionate principles hypothetically motivate that move. It was unprecedented in English common law, that move. It was all buried under this leftist compassion, which is mostly a lie. It is a mystery, it is a mystery, because it is the case that there is something about the Nazi doctrine that seems to have a visceral impact, that the communist doctrine doesn't have. Whereas what's happening on the left that's horrifying is murky. It might even be multidimensional. Like maybe there isn't a single radical leftist idea that's murderous like the racial superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of 3, or maybe it's some set of 4 out of 10. Who knows? So, and because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among the communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you think, if you go back to 1914, it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempts to bring about the socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devils, the Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine, but it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, when I hear someone say that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. Or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment. Here's a fun story. Do you know that it is now illegal for physicians to list starvation as the cause of death for a Venezuelan child in a hospital? That's how they're dealing with the fact of starvation, right? You just make it illegal to have that diagnosed as your cause of death. That'll solve the problem. They're trying to move our socialist party, the NDP, New Democratic Party, towards the acceptance of this LEAP manifesto, which doesn't look like it's going to happen. But they were all radical promoters of the Venezuelan government before everything went like badly sideways. I think the average Venezuelan now has lost 17 pounds. And that's not because they were put on a voluntary dieting program, right? It's not good. And so if you're tilting towards the left and you're temperamentally inclined that way, and half the population is, then you have an ethical problem on your hands, which is, how do you segregate yourself from the radical policies that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? And you can't just say, well, that's not my problem. It's like, well, okay, if it's not your problem now, it certainly might become your problem in the future. So, and I would say it's actually everybody's problem. In the aftermath of the 20th century, it's everybody's problem. It doesn't matter where you put these policies into play, the same bloody outcome occurred. It didn't matter whether it was Russia or China or Cambodia or Vietnam, or to pick a random African country, or Cuba or Venezuela for that matter. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. And so to me, that's experiment plus replication. Enough. The intellectual left in the West has been absolutely appalling in their silence on the communist catastrophe. So we're not done with this yet. And the Korean state, North Korea, as an emblematic representative of the communist catastrophe, and everyone there starves. There's millions of people died 20 years ago. It's not got any better. It's not like we solved this problem. And there's a deafening silence on the intellectual side of the spectrum with regards to what happened on the egalitarian left. And there's no excuse for it.